Fresh out of 1999, we have Bloody Murder here. This was a pretty popular rental back in the day, probably at the Blockbuster areas. I actually never seen it till recently when the local video store went out of business, and I picked it and the sequel up. And you know, watching it now, it's one of the movies that makes me wonder how somebody didn't get sued. Basically, we're ripping off a whole heck of a lot of horror films here. We're ripping off, of course, Friday the 13th, and we're ripping off Scream a little bit. Of course, this was 1999, so what movie wasn't trying to rip off Scream at the time? So the legendary mass killer at this camp is a guy by the name of Trevor Morehouse. Now, that sounds like a pretty geeky name if you ask me. I mean, you have all this time, but you come up with Morehouse, that's the best you can do. We've got some pretty attractive women running around. They're at a camp. You know, there's a legend of Trevor Morehouse killing people, and we know somebody's killing people because we see it when the movie starts. Pretty quickly on, this thing turns into a big whodunit, and then, you know, we get some red herrings throughout the movie. And at one point, I thought I actually guessed it, but I was wrong. It ended up being somebody else. So the movie's pretty clever that way, but then again, if you really think about it, a lot of it really doesn't make much sense. So you're doing a slasher film. You need some gore. This movie doesn't really have that. You need some TNA. This movie doesn't show any bear skin, although there is some attractive women running around. You need a lot of kills. The movie has quite a few kills, but they're kind of subpar. It's kind of like they go halfway, like somebody gets impaled, you know, in the chest, and there's blood, but it could have been a whole lot better, and it seems like the movie kind of pulls back a little bit. Sadly, the movie comes to us from Ariston, which I believe was eventually bought out by Lionsgate. And it's in a full screen form. I don't think a widescreen version of this exists, and it looks kind of rough now, but it was 1999, so I can kind of look over that. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, when you watch Bloody Murder, there's not really much of a redeemable quality to it. There's a pretty hot lead, but she really couldn't act her way out of a wet paper bag. Nobody on this movie really can. So, Bloody Murder is bad, kind of still in a somewhat entertaining way, but not quite. So if I was going to score Bloody Murder, it'd be a 2 out of 5. Only for those who absolutely love slashers, which I do. But even with some of the lower slasher standards, this one doesn't quite measure up.